Regarding the prospects of humanity's peace and development, there is both expectation and concern. All sides are awaiting a clear Chinese stance.
In his final address of 2017, Chinese President Xi Jinping charts a course forward after a dynamic year. What's next for China in 2018? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. In a New Year's address, Chinese President Xi Jinping lauded the country's accomplishments of 2017 and gave a roadmap for China's priorities in 2018. 2017 was a big year for China, from President Xi's travels to Davos to hosting the first Belt and Road Initiative Forum to the 19th CPC meeting in Beijing. China is taking the lead across the world and at home, so what's the outlook for China in the coming year? Joining us now in the studio, Victor Gao is a Chinese international relations expert from Beijing. Wang is a China analyst with the Economist Intelligence Unit. From London, Martin Jacques is author of When China Rules the World and a senior fellow in politics and international studies at Cambridge University. And from Phoenix, Jacques deLisle is a professor and director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Martin, let me start with you. We heard a lot in President Xi's New Year speech about China's diplomatic accomplishments and how it sees its role internationally in the year ahead. Let's listen to part of what the president had to say.
As a responsible major country, China must speak out. China will staunchly safeguard the authority and status of the United Nations and actively fulfill its due responsibility and duty in international affairs. China will honor its promises in countering global climate change and actively push forward the common construction of the Belt and Road. China will act as a builder of world peace and a contributor to global development and an upholder of the international order. The Chinese people are willing to join all peoples of the world in creating a beautiful future of greater prosperity and greater peace for mankind.
So, Martin, there we heard the broad themes from the Chinese president. But looking at the international agenda, what do you believe are China's priorities for the year ahead and, of course, beyond that as well?
Well, I mean, I agree with what you said in the introduction, that 2017 was really a remarkable year in terms of China's growing influence in the world. And I think that China will be looking at 2018 to continue that process, and I think there's a fair chance that China will be able to build on the achievements of 2017 and before that. I mean, I think that the biggest problem facing China is its relationship with the United States, and I think this is, although China's done its best to hold the ground and seek a dialogue with Trump and so on, I mean, we all know that this situation is very unpredictable. Trump is very unpredictable. The direction of America is very different from from China, more different than it's been perhaps at any stage since the 1970s. And so I think this will be the biggest concern of China, the relationship with the United States. And I think it's got two major aspects. One is on the trade front. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm somewhat pessimistic on the trade front. I think the United States is likely to move in the direction of protectionist measures, and that will create some serious problems. How does China respond to it? How far does Trump go, and so on? So that's one question. And the other major question, which of course has been linked to it during the last few months, is Korea and the handling of Korea. And I'm slightly more optimistic about this, having heard this latest statement from Kim Jong-un. I think there might be a tiny shaft of light which helps China to get off the back foot on Korea. I think it's been on the back foot over the last year on Korea, and begin to make, you know, most things China's been on the front foot, but not on Korea.
Victor, what is your view on that? You know, the president sounded very optimistic in his address, but as Martin Jacques points out, there are major challenges, the biggest of which is the relationship with the United States.
Indeed, I think China-U.S. relations in the coming year, in 2018, as well as beyond, will be the most challenged issue faced by both China and the United States. I think fundamentally the problem is that the United States has not yet come to the terms with the prospect that China will become larger as an economy and probably more important as a country on the global stage than the United States. All the other countries, including Germany, France, Britain, and Japan, have more or less come to terms with that reality. So, in the United States, how to grapple with that prospect and how to become more comfortable with that prospect, and how to look at China not as an adversary, rather as a partner going forward. That's the main challenge. If this is not handled properly, then China-U.S. relations may actually suffer great ups and downs, and eventually both countries, both China and the United States, may become victims of the turbulence that the bilateral relations may need to go through in the coming years.
Okay, let me go to Don Wang. Don Wang, we heard, in that speech, China cemented its rise as a global power in 2017. And as we heard President Xi telling us there that it plans to forge ahead with its vision for a more interconnected world. So we heard a lot of momentum there. There was a lot of momentum in 2017. How do they move forward now? How does China move forward from this past year into the new year?
Well, China really surprised the world by its stable growth in 2017, and we anticipate the economic growth can reach as high as 6.8%, with the ultra-low inflation is way below 3%. But in 2018, we think this momentum can continue for a little bit, but then all these other problems will loom, and that will make it very difficult for China, especially when the United States is having a tax cut and interest rate is rising in the United States, and that would pose a great pressure on China to raise its own interest rate, and also there will be the inflation risk coming very soon. So how to deal with those problems will determine how China will stay competitive in the future, especially when it comes to the value of the Chinese yuan. It's getting to this very delicate balance now.
Jacques deLisle, China's status as a global power has come at a time when, as we've just heard from Martin Jacques, when the United States is adopting a policy of America first, looking inward, and we could see there is a danger, there could be protectionist measures that are imposed by the United States. But if we look at the other side of that, how does that give China the opportunity to take the lead and set the global agenda with this, a United States that's looking more domestically?
Well, I think it gives China a great deal of opportunity. We've seen the U.S. withdraw from the kinds of things that would continue the traditional U.S. role of pushing for greater economic integration, greater liberalism in the international economy. That's been in decline for some time, and we talk about Trump's cancellation of U.S. membership in the TPP. There were actually problems with the TPP predating that. It was in trouble even under Obama. But whatever one wants to attribute it to, the U.S. withdrawal from that role really has left the field wide open for China. So now things like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that is largely a Chinese creation, things like One Belt, One Road, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, these are all the more dynamic institutions that are out there for global economic integration, as we see the U.S. again not only scuttling the TPP, but having stood in the way of World Bank reform, IMF reform, the kinds of institutions that at one point were closely associated with American internationalism in the post-war era and in the post-Cold War era. So as the U.S. withdraws, that leaves that field open for China, and Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang have taken that opportunity. We've seen it at Davos, we've seen it at the 19th Party Congress, we've seen it in the New Year's speech from President Xi.
Victor, one of the biggest stories in China this past year, 2017, and about China was the conference, the CPC conference. We heard there the outlines of where China wants to go in the years ahead. The Chinese ambassador to the United States talked about President Xi's speech today. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
Well, it's very encouraging to listen to the president for his New Year's message. You see, last October, we had the 19th Party Congress, which drew up a new blueprint for China. And the year 2018 will be the first year to implement this new blueprint. we are confident that we'll be able to make new achievements, make new progress, and make new contribution to the international community.
So there we see this vision being set out there. How is it translated into concrete action?
Well, the roadmap adopted by the 19th Party Congress sets target not only for 2018, but all the way to 2035, and then to the middle of the century. And so the goals are very clearly delineated. And as far as 2018 is concerned, it will be the first full year to implement the goals set by the 19th Party Congress. So all the devils are in the details, and China need to do a good implementation of the goals. And for example, eliminating poverty by 2020 and achieve moderately developed country status by 2035, and then to achieve a comprehensively developed economy by the middle of this century. And I think China will be very much focused on delivering and executing all these goals at home. And this is also very much related to the international front of what China needs to do. That is promoting the One Belt, One Road initiative and try to become really a very important champion of free trade on the global stage and tearing down the barriers, including infrastructure barriers, for example, so that goods and services can be delivered across national borders, across Eurasian continent, across to Africa, Latin America, and Northern America, for example, with greater ease and greater efficiency. So both at home in China as well as on the global stage, China will promote free trade and more liberalization of trade. And this is in sharp contrast with what President Donald Trump is preaching for the United States.
That's very important, actually, that China is expanding its relationship with the rest of the world, especially the developing world. Martin, Jacques, let me ask you this. As you pointed out, the big challenge for China would be its relationship with the United States. But of course, we live in a changing world right now where alliances are changing around the world. How does the rest of the world view what is going on in China right now, what they've seen in 2017 and what they hope to see in 2018?
Well, I think, there's no question that the axis of change in the world is not about the relationship between China and the United States. That is the most important relationship, but it's not the axis of change. The axis of change is China's relationship, above all, with the developing world. And that's illustrated, for example, by the Belt and Road Initiative. But that is really the driver. This is an extraordinary historic shift from a world dominated by 15% of the world's population, which is what the West and Japan have represented, to 85% of the world, which lives in the developing world. And I think this is perhaps the underlying reason why China is aligned with what I will call the emergent modernity of our time. That China's introducing a new kind of common sense, a new kind of way of looking at the world, which actually already chimes with the way many people think. Now, obviously, given all this, the greatest support I would suggest for China in the world today lies in the developing world. I mean, if you want to look at countries which look to China for the experience, I'm not going to say model, but for the experience of how to transform a developing their countries, then it is in the developing world. And naturally, as we would expect, the developed world, the rich world, the Western world in particular, is more skeptical. Above all, of course, the United States, because the United States is the one country it feels threatened by the rise of China. But even with Europe, which doesn't feel it's and knows it's no longer any kind of global hegemon, it's got all sorts of reservations, historic reservations, cultural reservations, ideological reservations about China. And I think one of the big things, I think the objective of China's foreign policy is to try and occupy the center ground, is to try and build a new common sense, to build as broad a range of support around its initiatives as possible. In effect, I think, to squeeze any Trumpist kind of initiatives to, in a sense, tear the global house down. And so far, China's been very successful at this, but we'll see what happens in the coming year.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Coming up, more on China's outlook for the new year. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.